Robby, how do you define libertarianism and its primary tenets, and why those tenets are the most beneficial for the same groups, individuals, families, and society?
Right. So it's very simple. We libertarians want the government to be as uninvolved in your lives and my life as humanly possible. There are some libertarians who think no government at all would be just fine, and that sounds pretty good to me. But in the real world, maybe some compromises. But we're so far from the ideal state that my answer to basically everything and most of the things we're going to talk about tonight is that the government should be not involved, or at least should be much less involved than it is now. There are basically two main reasons for this for the libertarian position. So there are there are philosophical based reason, which is just that it's immoral. Many libertarians view that it's state aggression against you is immoral, just as if your neighbor tried to rob you or some random person on the street. That is not really different than when the government gets together and does it. So the moral reasons for having a very limited or non-existent government, and then probably what's more persuasive to most people is practical reasons. The government, our government, and governments around the world certainly cause a lot of suffering and misery, and do not have a lot of specific expertise at running or organizing society. If you leave people alone, they pretty much flourish on their own by setting what rules work for them in individual situations and having voluntary associations. They start businesses that improve the world. Meanwhile, the government uses our resources very inefficiently and makes everyone angry and violates your rights all the time. Amazon has a private company that exists because people freely got together in a free market system and created it, has like perfected the art of meeting human need. I realized I was out of like my hair gel when we got here to the hotel as I was unpacking, and I, with like 2 clicks of a button, was able to order more that's going to appear at my apartment before I even get back there. Meanwhile, the IRS cannot even reliably tell me how much money I owe it every year. It knows, it just doesn't tell you, and is going to harass or put you in jail if you get it wrong. So most people, I think, understand on most fronts that the government causes a lot of harm, and we ought to be as left alone as possible. But then, of course, different people have different issues. They say, well, this is a problem and we need somebody to solve it, and somehow our own voluntary means are failing. So I think most people have a lot of libertarian instincts, but then have a couple exceptions. Then if you added all those exceptions up together, then all of a sudden you get very much away from a libertarian framework. The things we're going to talk about tonight are, I think, good examples of that. And while I agree with many of the principles that were elucidated there in the kind of conservative manifesto, conservative worldview statement, I think conservatives have, violated many of those basic principles when it comes to tech issues. For example, wanting the government to do more to punish tech companies or to solve very nebulous and poorly defined, and to my mind, not well demonstrated social problems of supposed addiction and harm that I think massively understate the actual benefits of tech and social media in general. But I'm sure we're going to get into that. But I would have no quarrel with my conservative friends if they agreed our government should be limited to the vision at its founding, and should pretty much just stick to providing security and protection from violence and some kind of coherent national defense problem. We would, not have anything to argue about. But these tech issues are very much into the sector of individual behavior and frankly of speech, because a lot of the tech companies we're talking about, the social media platforms, are creators of speech, which is among the most sacred and protected thing by our founding documents. There is a greater prohibition on the federal government and its agents taking action with respect to speech than just about anything in our founding documents. It's the most rigorously defended right at the Supreme Court level. And my view is, and we'll get into it, is that a lot of the things conservatives want the government to do on the tech front actually end up, even when they're objecting to what the government has done previously, which I share and I think has created a lot of censorship, many of their proposed solutions, I think, violate the First Amendment very clearly in sort of exactly the way they're upset about. But I think we're going to get into that next.
Great. So our students here, they're on a personal journey to their beliefs I'm sure they all have some now, but I'd like to understand how you arrived at your belief. So, Claire, was there a pivotal moment or experience that led you to conservatism, or did your beliefs evolve over time? Did you start out somewhere else and end up at conservatism? So, what could you tell us about your journey?
Sure. So I'm from Vermont. I was raised in a conservative family in Vermont. So we were a minority in a pretty progressive and also kind of strains of libertarianism state. But so I absorbed a lot of these conservative values from my home and from my faith community there, high values for life, marriage, the family, and God. But my parents and my also fantastic high school government teacher also gave me a huge love for our country and the Constitution, and the principles that Robby was just describing of the American founding. So I really like devoured the Federalist Papers in high school. I loved, just learning about how we came to form the Constitution that we have, the protections they put in place for the endurance of a self-governing republic, separation of powers and checks and balances. I was a huge government nerd. So I had this kind of experience in high school through my government classes of a really deep love and appreciation for the Constitution. And I just recognized that, America had the greatest form of government in the world, but we were still young. This is still an experiment, and it's one that still needs to be protected and defended. I also say, though, Vermont, despite not being a very conservative state, has a very strong sense of local community and a kind of resistance to outside big corporations. So there's only one Walmart in the whole state. And there's no billboards on the highway. So there was also this kind of sense of that kind of strain of, I guess, conservatism, a value for the kind of local community, local families was also instilled in me. Going off to college, I think some of my views were tested. I think college is a time of testing, which is good. And it's good to have those kind of conversations and be challenged in your views. And I think that helped me solidify some of my conservative convictions and the reasons that I held them. I will also say another kind of defining experience of college was I really saw this kind of culture of intolerance on campus growing. So there were only certain views that were tolerated, and others were kind of persecuted and slandered. So, if you believe there was only one God, or that marriage is only between a man and a woman, or that life begins at conception, those kinds of views were not tolerated. And I think I saw this loss of kind of an interest in pursuing and searching for truth. And truth became very subjective, and it was what everyone defined it to be for themselves. And you're supposed to make your own truth, and you couldn't really correct or object to anyone else's. And that instilled in me a conviction that for our government to continue, we had to have a free and open public square to have debates about fundamental truths. And that was not happening on the college campus. And so I think I recognized just the need to protect freedom of speech, as Robby was saying, for all religious and political viewpoints. And so that is obviously increasingly threatened today by big tech. And then I'll say the last kind of defining thing in my journey was I did get to serve in the Trump administration. And regardless of what you think of Trump and his flaws, which I think people acknowledge, it was an eye-opening experience for me to see the government, the federal government and bureaucracy from the inside, and to really realize that our country was not being run by the people through their elected representatives in Congress, but it was actually being run by the administrative state, unelected bureaucrats passing rules and regulations that were not representative of the American people or their values, and unaware of the daily realities of the everyday American. And so I think my experience seeing that from the inside, and the kind of lack of respect for federalism and the huge expansion and growth of the federal government to take on more and more power and control and intrude more and more into our lives, which I think is something that Robby and I would both agree on, also kind of instilled and shored me up in that conviction that the best government would be a limited self-government that reflects the view of the common man, or the republic of the common man, as Teddy Roosevelt has said. So I think that those kind of three periods, being Vermont in a conservative family, being tested my views in college, and kind of witnessing a culture of intolerance on college campuses, and then working firsthand inside of the federal government and seeing the administrative state, all kind of shored up my conservative views.
Okay. Okay. Robby, how did your personal experiences shape your libertarian views?
Sure. I grew up in a Republican household with kind of standard Republican views, but my family was not particularly religious, although I was raised Catholic. So I had conservative or Republican views on economic issues, but over time just came to have, I would say, socially liberal or socially tolerant views on social issues. But the major event of my sort of young education, high school, transitioning to college was the Iraq War. And that I think is what transformed me into like a hardcore libertarian, because I was naively, I was in high school at the time, but supportive of, what the Republican president was saying our foreign policy should be. And the decision to invade Iraq, it's not even controversial to say so today, because I think even like most Republicans, frankly, agree with it. And part of Donald Trump's success was breaking, at least rhetorically, with this foreign policy, but just the catastrophic decision to launch a war and start doing nation building in the Middle East, and how costly that has been and what a disaster it's been, helped call into question for me whether, not just specific people, but whether institutionally our federal government is capable of making these kinds of judgment calls and decisions, and relying on, these are things experts and intelligence experts and security experts, so many of them said this was a good idea, and it was not. So that was my kind of formative political moment.
Okay, great. So let's move on to big tech and regulation. So when we think about big tech, who is it we're talking about when we say big tech? When I think about it, I think about social media firms, Twitter, TikTok, Instagram. I also add in Google because it controls search, Amazon because it controls access to books and products, and Apple because it controls who gets on the App Store, Patreon and PayPal because they facilitate payments, Spotify and Substack, which allow you to individual creators to go reach people. And then now with AI, I would add in Microsoft, OpenAI, other big AI firms. So is that kind of that whole conglomeration is who we're talking about? Okay. So now we've set the scope on that. Let's go to regulation. Robby, let's start with you. So libertarians often emphasize minimal government intervention. How does this apply to companies in general and big tech in particular? And how does limiting that improve our lives?
Sure. I should recognize, and Claire probably agrees with me, that she would want to change some of the existing laws, but the law as it is right now gives tremendous protection to social media companies, to big tech platforms, to set their own policies with regard to speech, and decide what kind of content they want on their platforms, and not suffer repercussions for that. Obviously, to some extent, the First Amendment just provides private actors the right to have to engage in speech you want, and the government can't restrict it. So these are very big forums, obviously, but they are private companies that can have policies for who's allowed to speak. Just like this forum, just like we wouldn't say it's, if I had not been invited to participate here, I wouldn't be censored, right? In some sense, we've not invited everyone else in the world to participate in here. We're not censoring them. Censorship is what the federal government does when it punishes you for speech. Now, there has been, we absolutely agree on this. There has been a lot of pervasive censorship on social media that has actually been motivated by the federal government and federal involvement. What we've learned over the last 2 years is that the White House and the State Department and the FBI and all sorts of other agents, the CDC, had applied tremendous pressure to social media platforms to push certain speech policies. I think this was very inappropriate. It's right now being litigated. The case is Missouri versus Biden. The Supreme Court just this weekend, I believe, or a few days ago, agreed to take it up. So we're going to find out whether I think that it does, but we'll find out if the Supreme Court agrees that this overt and heavy-handed is called jawboning, when the federal government tries to extort a private company to engage in a speech policy that it knows it couldn't pass a law to make them do. So we'll find out. But I would generally say that we're living in a very as much as, just like my fellow participants here, I have bemoaned the cancel culture and the rise of self-canceling and censorship and unwillingness to have robust conversations that I know happens on some college campuses. I have no idea what the climate is like here. I hope it's healthier. But I will say we are living in actually a golden era for dissident viewpoints, and people who want to regulate the tech platforms out of existence ought to always recall. I'm old enough to remember what things were like before these platforms did not exist. And before these platforms didn't exist, there were none of these alternative or conservative or libertarian or contrarian or even like far left media platforms existed. Social media has has resulted in a great flourishing. It is easier. You are less constrained than ever before to share your opinion online, to create voluntary associations of thought havers, to talk to people all over the world at a click of a button, at a snap of your fingertips. It's like really great. I can't imagine that anyone actually wants to go back to the era before any of these things, when to participate in public debate on an issue was to like write a letter to the editor. I mean, that was the era when I was a kid. That's something that I think even the critics of big tech on the right especially don't actually want. We should be grateful that this is the healthiest time to practice free speech ever in human history is in America with the tech platforms that we have. So there are plenty of legitimate criticisms, and we can come up with strategies to deal with them, but throwing the baby out with the bathwater proverbially would be very, very bad for the discourse.
Let me push back just a little bit on that. So, it seems like, correct me if I'm wrong, but the libertarian view is like, well, if you don't like it, go start your own Twitter or your own Facebook, or Instagram. And that sounds great, but there's huge barriers to entry to go doing that. So is that really a realistic position?
Well, I didn't say that, but there are, a number of different platforms, all with somewhat different policies. Elon Musk is now taking what's now called X in a very different direction. And there are thriving conservative media. Actually, if you look at Facebook on any given day, the top 10 articles are from townhall.com, the Daily Wire, the Daily Caller, Breitbart, Tucker Carlson's Facebook page. It is underemphasized by conservatives, at least, how massively important the Facebook platform has been for conservative thought being spread. There's a reason that Elizabeth Warren and Joe Biden and other Democrats want a regulation that would strangle Facebook. It's because they perceive, I think wrongly, but they perceive that it was that Donald Trump was elected because Mark Zuckerberg allowed too many conservatives to say things on Facebook. What I don't understand, maybe Claire can help explain it to me, why so many Republican legislators have gotten on board with the exact regulatory tweak that Elizabeth Warren wants for Facebook and other platforms. Like, how would that be good? But no, obviously you can't just necessarily go out and start your own thing. But the Daily Wire is building a very interesting and competently run alternative media platform. Tucker's now independent on X, and actually the rules as they exist that give broad protection to the platforms to operate how they want, how the platform wants, are empowering all these voices. Again, many Democrats think this is very bad, but I support a flourishing and everyone's right to try to have their own way about it. So it's not, just you couldn't just start your own Instagram or something, but I don't see unanimity out there. It's wild and chaotic and crazy, and it's different on different platforms, and that seems healthy. That seems like democracy and the discourse functioning in a healthy way.
Great. Yeah, go ahead and take the conservative view.
Yeah. And I think we'll get more into the censorship stuff specifically, but just stepping back a minute about the broader question of, whether there is a role for the government to step in and regulate big tech in any instances. I would say that for conservatives, again, the free market is not ultimate. It does not always result in the best outcome for human flourishing and for individuals. So I would say that there's kind of a few instances where we're not trying to impose sweeping regulations like there might be some on the left that you referenced, Elizabeth Warren, might be trying to do. And I wouldn't even say we're trying to regulate these platforms out of existence or diminish their importance. But I would say there's a time to intervene in the free market to correct for market failures when the interests of businesses are not aligned with the best interests of consumers. When the market's hurting consumers, or when the market becomes so consolidated, yielding monopolies that are starting to actually wield a lot of political power, which is what we're seeing with the Missouri versus Biden case, that these companies were so big and their influence was able to be exerted politically, and they succumbed to political influence from the White House. And the reason they could throttle certain speech is because there are very few of these platforms that are hosting this type of content. So we do have kind of monopoly in this space. But I would just say there's a kind of returning to this older conservative Republican tradition of Teddy Roosevelt and recognizing that, monopolies are not, a natural development, but a political choice. And when they start to undermine the republic of the common man, when oligarchies are really running the country, rather than reflecting the common citizen, there's a role for the government to intervene. And, historically that has meant breaking up those monopolies or trying to open up competition in the market. And so I'm not an antitrust expert, but that would be in the body of antitrust law. But I would also say there is a role too for the government to regulate new technologies. I think we'll get into AI later, and innovations in order to ensure that they're not replacing or eroding the values and traditions and institutions that we see as necessary for the common good and for human flourishing. And so we'll also get into, I think, talking about harms to kids. But I think for conservatives, when we see certain technologies are harmful to children and families, and there's not been an avenue for holding those companies accountable, which is due to Section 230's kind of closed off litigation, which is the normal means of ensuring that businesses are not harming consumers. That requires, and I think, a collective solution for the government to step in. So I think there's issues of speech, there's issues of market concentration, there's issues of harms to kids and undermining our institutions. And I think that, again, the solutions that I will advocate for when we get into the specifics are very limited and targeted. I'm not advocating for broad sweeping regulation or trying to regulate companies out of existence, but I do think that there's an importance to protect all viewpoints. And so I don't think, we have to tell and dictate exactly what content the platforms are running or not allowed to run. That would obviously be a violation of the First Amendment and our protection of speech, but that there is actually a legitimate category for making sure that certain companies that are offering their goods to the public in such a way that they've become really the dominant platforms and channels of communication. To Robby's point, this is where everyone is interacting. Then we need to ensure that those are open to all citizens and there's not discrimination happening against just certain viewpoints. So with that, those are kind of my categories for like when a conservative would say this is a place where we need actually help from the government to correct a market failure or where there should be a limit placed by the government on some of the free market.
Okay, so let's hit those. So we'll get into censorship and social media's effects or big tech's effects on children and then into AI. So you talked about one reason people on the right believe big tech, at least in the conservative part, needs to be regulated is their belief that big tech discriminates against conservatives and libertarian speech. So Clare, do you believe that's true, that they're biased in that? And if so, specifically, what should be done to address that? And then would liberals agree with the things that you're putting in place? And if so, why?
Yes, I do think there's bias and censorship happening. And I appreciate what Robby was saying, like, okay, there's a lot of conservative articles or media that are popular on these platforms. I'm not denying that, but there's clear evidence that certain viewpoints have been canceled or censored, particularly around the kind of Hunter Biden laptop story that was suppressed before the last election. I think that's now like very clearly undeniable. So there's some big, like, obvious examples of censorship against a particular viewpoint, but increasingly like pro-life groups are having their content or their posts restricted or ads removed. A lot of conservative and religious views are being censored by Twitter and others. And so there's clearly censorship of certain viewpoints happening. Now, the solutions that I would propose, I don't think that liberals are on board with at least some of the proposals that I would say. The main kind of argument I've made in terms of addressing censorship is using a body of law called common carrier law, which has a lot of historical precedence, and it basically recognizes that sometimes there are private businesses that are providing a key good to the public. Often there were mainly businesses providing access to channels of transportation or communication. So historically, these would have been ferry boats or telegraphs or companies that are providing this type of access channels to the public, but they're provided by private businesses. The government said, you can't discriminate against users because you are the ones providing this, and there's a need for all these to be accessible to the public. They would give them some type of government incentive, a tax break or protection from certain liability to make sure that people weren't being discriminated against. I've made the argument along with some other law professors that today the big tech platforms, particularly the social media platforms, are like modern day common carriers. This, to Robby's point, is where debate and exchange of ideas is happening, is on these few channels, again, because of their kind of market concentration and monopoly power. This is where everyone's talking. So yes, like the kind of argument you can go off and make your own. It's like, well, but then who's going to really be hearing your ideas? Because it's all been kind of consolidated on a few platforms where this is happening. And so to that end, we want to ensure that certain viewpoints aren't being discriminated against on those platforms. Again, this gets back to my original point. For the endurance of our limited self-government, we need to have a free and open exchange and debate of ideas in our society. And I would also say that Section 230, the law that governs the internet today, which has given these companies immunity really from any liability, and we can get into this more later, but it's really been overly expanded, has given the companies the kind of first half of that typical common carrier regulatory bargain, but with no corresponding requirements or stick that they not discriminate against certain viewpoints. So there was a law passed in Texas towards this end that was upheld by the Fifth Circuit. So that's the only kind of law of the kind of common carrier kind that's been tested so far. But the Supreme Court is now going to hear that case this fall. So it'll be interesting. I would expect them to, again, uphold that Texas law because it's very narrow. It's not restricting people's First Amendment rights to speech. It's just seeking to protect all viewpoints being allowed to be represented on these platforms. And again, individual would still have to go to court and prove, that the company discriminated against them based on their certain political or religious viewpoints. So it just opens up that channel, though, of accountability and litigation that's been closed, because to date, all you can do if your post gets taken down is appeal to the company themselves and try to beg them to put it back on. So this would actually allow people a means of presenting their case and saying, I think I've been discriminated against because of a particular viewpoint. So I view this as really important to protecting free speech. And so those are the kind of solutions I've advocated for. And as of yet, I've not seen a liberal support them. So.
So, Robby, how do you reconcile the libertarian values of free expression and support for the First Amendment with the rights of private companies to set their own content policies?
Well, I mean, the only thing to reconcile there is, I guess, like a philosophical question, right? I think the platforms ought to act with an interest in promoting civic integrity and civil participation and free speech and tolerance for viewpoints, but they are absolutely not required to under the First Amendment. Again, the First Amendment prohibits the government from making content-based restrictions, and going back to this, a vast percentage of the censorship, if we're using that term, that we've seen on social media over the last few years was in fact motivated by the government improperly, in my view, telling the companies to adopt certain policies with respect to COVID. It was where it was very extreme. Debates that I think people ought to have about where the virus originated and which mitigation policies were effective, and all of that were very much effectively cut off by the CDC's communications with these platforms, which absolutely put their thumb on the scales. We can constrain that behavior because we can constrain what the federal government does, and I absolutely think we ought to. Trying to create some nebulous right to sue the company for maybe discriminating against you gets into really difficult terrain because, these platforms, they don't charge you to use them. They make money by selling a curated user experience that they curate. They want to make the platform more attractive to you to spend time there, for you to see relevant advertisements and products you might want to buy, for you to be having a positive time there. Like, that's how they make money. This is part of the reason I find that the whole idea that they're monopolies, like, utterly laughable. They're not, and the theory of antitrust in America is that there's a harm to the consumer, and if there's harm to consumer, then the federal government has some right to break up the company. Obviously, as a libertarian, I don't even buy that, but okay, I acknowledge that exists. Well, what the power of these platforms is not harming the consumer in the same way that like Standard Oil. Okay, so there's one oil company and they're a monopoly because they bought all the other oil companies, and now they can charge whatever they want for oil because they don't face competition, and that's like the classic dilemma that antitrust law exists to solve. Well, we can see very easily that that's not the case here. This is not a finite resource. This isn't a product. It's speech, which Facebook competes with Twitter and TikTok and honestly all sorts of other platforms like Reddit and Twitch and a million other things. They are different and distinct from each other. They offer some overlapping products. They're clearly not harming the consumers. They're not, and they're obviously not in an indomitable, can never be overcome position, because we watch them rise and fall all the time. Meta, sorry to break anyone's hearts here if you're like own shares in the company, but I doubt Meta will ever again have the influence over the discourse that it did in 2016. They're losing Facebook, the main product, the Facebook Blue, is losing market shares, losing users. Instagram is losing out to TikTok. Elon Musk, regardless of what you think of him, he like deleted $30 billion worth of value in the company in a few short weeks. When I was a kid, I couldn't imagine not using AOL Instant Messenger and MySpace. Those were the dominant tech social media platforms when I was a kid. It would have been unthinkable for me to go, a day without them. What are those companies worth today? Zero. There has been so much destruction, good, healthy, creative destruction in the tech sector. Companies rise and fall. If you track like the top 5, the top 10 financially viable companies in this market over time, there's constant movement. So I don't like philosophically, I don't view them as monopolies, and I think it's inarguable. I mean, it can be argued. We're arguing about it, but I think they very clearly don't fit what was meant by antitrust law in the idea that we have to protect consumers from one predatory player gobbling up the market. Like that has not occurred. And in fact, we mostly like and benefit from what's being offered. Again, particularly if you lump Apple and Amazon into this, which are positively companies that are wildly positively viewed by the American consumer. Americans don't like their government. They think the Senate and the House and the executive are totally dysfunctional, and they love what many of these companies have to offer. And I think that should tell us something.
Sure. Yeah, go for it.
I was going to say, although users consent to these platforms, my point about this is the public square of today. If people want their views or opinions to be heard, they're forced to go to these main channels. But if the company is not upholding their end of the obligation of hosting their content, then what is their means of legal recourse if a company decides to take it down? So I do think it is important for our democracy that free speech and the public square is defended. And I would again say it's a narrow kind of anti-discrimination law. And I would say that I do think these companies are harming consumers, which I think is the next topic we're going to get into, is particularly children. So I think there actually is real harm.
Okay, great. So Robby, from a libertarian standpoint, we are going to talk about children now. What evidence do you see that the effects of big tech has a large negative effect on children? And should there be any restrictions on access to their products for children, or should the onus be on parents and guardians?
Yeah, this is definitely the in vogue topic or area of this discussion, one that I think has ensnared a lot of people in really all political traditions, right, left, center, et cetera. Jonathan Haidt, who's a professor of business at NYU, I believe, someone I hold a lot of respect for and has been associated with libertarians and has done a lot of good work for the magazine I write for, has kind of been leading the charge on this, that he thinks social media is very bad for the mental health of young people. And yet the media has really kind of fallen in love with this idea. And look, he makes a case for it. He has like 300 studies he points to that he says indicates in that direction. I am not at all persuaded by his case, and also by the specific studies he points to. I am not like smart enough to take apart each and every one of them, but we had a brilliant Harvard statistician look at them for us at Reason and go through each study, and you can go like look at this article on Reason, and he looks at each study and why why it should not have been published and has like major problems to reach its conclusion. I mean, like trying to survey people about their mental health and how it correlates to their social media usage is in fact a very fraught, a difficult thing to do. I don't think, I would never make the claim that social media is not harmful at all. I absolutely think for some users, excessive social media use is bad for their mental health, just like excessive anything really is bad for your mental health or bad for your physical health. And I certainly support empowering parents to help make different choices for their family, to do common sense things like, you know, keep the phones away from the dinner table and not in the bedroom at night so kids can get a good night's sleep. For, you know, schools to make decisions to keep people focused and not on their phones all the time. I'm not saying these things can't be addictive or can't have downsides, but the idea that there are these vast pervasive harms is not nearly as well sourced as it's being claimed. Also, a lot of young people use, I mean, you're young people, right? I'm speaking for you, I think, use social media in beneficial ways to like network with their friends, to engage in positive social behavior, to do research, to learn. I host a YouTube show. It's on YouTube. It's on a social media platform. Clips of it are on TikTok. I think probably the most likely way that young people, I hope, learn from my current events show is by engaging with it on social media. I would not, I think to suddenly take that away from them would be very crazy. It would be exactly the kind of like utopian central planning I don't want the government to do. But yeah, I mean, maybe you should probably hear the affirmative case for why we ought to do something first. I have some areas of agreement on where things could be improved, but maybe you want to make the case for why I'm wrong.
Sure. Well, I mean, I think I would disagree about the evidence of harms, and I would also just say, like the social media industry is a predatory industry, like akin to gambling, tobacco, alcohol, other industries that
I think should be legal.
Yeah, so Robby and I guess agree on broader than just social media harms, but I would say that those things they're actively trying to addict their users, and so these platforms are not neutral. They hold themselves out as a free service, but they're trying to actively addict their users to extract their time, their attention, and their data and sell it to advertisers. So it's not free. Users are paying these companies with their data and their time and attention. And I would say the companies are also in a race to the bottom. They want the youngest users possible to profit off of them over the course of their lifetime. So the age of social media is supposed to be 13, is not meaningfully enforced. And so we know 8 to 12-year-olds are all over these platforms. And my point is that those is very harmful to children because their brains are still developing. So there's mental health issues for sure, but there's actually neurological concerns. And I think the same way that some of these other dangerous substances like alcohol or tobacco act on a brain is similar to the effects that they've shown similar effects of social media, that it actually acts like a substance and activates the same brain regions that other substances like drugs and alcohol activate, the kind of dopamine reward activation system. And there was actually a study done last year at UNC, your own campus, that was studying and actually brain imaging children who were frequent social media users over time, a longitudinal study from ages 12 to 17. And it found that there was actually changes in the brains of the students who were actively checking social media versus those who didn't, making their brains more highly wired and sensitive to the kind of social rewards of social media in a way beyond kind of normal development. And also then it led to the kind of corresponding lack of impulse control. So again, it's kind of like the catch-22 of an addict. The changes in the brain are both making them more sensitive to the reward that substance is offering, in this case, social media, and is reducing their ability to resist it, is actually inhibiting their self-control and impulse control. So I would say there's actually, and that's a peer-reviewed study in a scientific journal done by the University of North Carolina. And there's more and more research like this coming out. So there's actually hard scientific research, not just like social science research on the mental health effects, but hard science research on the neurological concerns. And so, I mean, we could debate a lot of the kind of research, but obviously, you know, the position I'm coming from is that they're harmful to children. And so I think there is an important role that the government has in this to empower parents. So I think it can sometimes get pitched as an either or, like, oh, well, we just have to let parents do their thing and there's no role for government. But I actually think it's a both and I'll just explain briefly why. The parents are often really it's very difficult to kind of fully protect their kids from the harms of social media, in the sense that these technologies have really changed the entire social environment that kids are growing up in. Jonathan Haidt has actually said there's not like a dose response relationship of social media the same way there is of sugar. Like, oh, if you just limit the amount of sugar, it's not bad for kids. Like, if you limit the amount of social media, that mitigates the harm, but it actually has a network level effect because of the environment changes that social media bring about. People can feel isolated or left out or experience anxiety or depression or these other mental health harms, even if they're not actively using social media because of the nature of the change. And that's what I think really makes the case for necessitating more collective level solutions. I'll also say, because of the way that there has been a lack of age verification or age enforcement on the platforms for even involved parents who want to make the choice that I don't want my kid on social media. It's very easy for a child to go behind their parents' back and falsify that information or create a second account that they don't know about. And even the best parental control softwares available for purchase are very limited. Certain apps like TikTok and Snapchat won't let third parties access their data, so parents cannot see it whatsoever into those apps, or direct messaging on Instagram. And so I think parents are actually really hampered in their current ability to effectively protect their kids. And so that's where I think there's a role for the government to step in to actually empower parents to do their job, not to replace it, but to help them. And so I'll just briefly say the laws that I've worked on are at the state level, which would be requiring age verification for social media platforms with corresponding parental consent for minors under the age of 18. And so, again, I'm not saying that there may not be, I mean, I would disagree with Robby about the benefits. But if, for example, a parent wants to allow their child on social media, that is that individual parent's decision. So it's not saying that we're taking or banning social media for minors or kids, but we're trying to actually put the power back in parents' hands to make that decision. And so these laws would just require parental consent and involvement. And I think that's a good kind of mix of both a government solution, actually empowering parents to be the parents. So that's kind of the solution that I've advocated for.
Great. Okay, we're going to I'll ask you one more question on AI, and then we're going to start taking questions from the audience. So if you've got some questions, line up over there. Okay, so AI. So with the advent of Chat GPT, explosion of generative AI products that can create text and music and video, there's big implications for our society in terms of the economy, our relationships with each other, with AI, our politics. It's potentially huge. And we're seeing an impact, obviously, in higher ed, but also the creation of AI boyfriends and girlfriends, the potential, major job losses, but also improvement in our standard of living potentially. We got also big impact of fake news on politics, and we really don't have any idea how this is all going to play out. So, Claire, how does conservatism view the rise of AI, and what do you think these AI firms and the government should do about it? And then, Robby, we'll turn that question over to you.
Yes, I think conservatives are concerned about the potential dangers of AI, particularly threats to children and families, but also to our form of government and way of life. So I think that there are potentials for AI to be harnessed for good. I know there's fields like agriculture and other things that are starting to try to use AI to increase, the productivity of their crops or things like that. So I'm certainly not opposed to the uses of AI in certain fields and industries. However, there are serious concerns and harms with some of these generative AI technologies, particularly some of the text to image based AIs. I mean, pedophiles can leverage these tools in a variety of ways to produce and distribute images of child sexual exploitation across the internet, like editing a genuine photograph, but then turning it into a nude or explicit image. And it's also then easy for children to access those AIs and ask them to generate explicit material. So I think it can really increase the amount of child exploitation material online, the ease of access or generating that content for minors themselves when they shouldn't be exposed to such material. And it also makes it increasingly difficult for law enforcement to identify real victims of child exploitation. So real victims will be hurt by the increasing amount of AI, because it will be more and more difficult for law enforcement to discern whether there's a real child being harmed in a certain image or not, or a real child was hurt once and then that image has been used and generated to generate thousands of images from that. So I do feel like there's real potentials for harms to children and families. And also even the kind of creation of AI boyfriends and girlfriends I view that as a real threat to marriage and family formation, because it's allowing people to really live in a complete fantasy world and not be grounded in reality. And I just think that that's very dangerous as embodied humans, to have these technologies enabling some really kind of dangerous materials. There's also been like scams on the elderly using AI. They use like the granddaughter's voice to call the grandmother, drawn from clips on social media or whatnot, to say that, she's been arrested and needs to make bail. And so, I mean, I just think that these technologies are going to be used and exploited against the most vulnerable. And so there's a role for the government to step in, and I think ensure that the way that these technologies are introduced are in a way that are not going to harm people, but to harness those. And so I would just say, like, one clear kind of solution is making clear that generative AI should not be covered by Section 230 immunity. This is not content by other people that they're hosting, but it's their own products that are generating this. And I think opening them up to the option of accountability, or kind of the threat of litigation, will ensure that the way that they're designing their products that they're not susceptible to being used to harm children or create sexual exploitation material or things like that. So I think there's more regulations that they could impose, like certain standards for the industry that would need to be met, so that companies aren't just acting dangerously and throwing their kind of open source code out to the internet for people like pedophiles or criminals to exploit. So I think it's important that we are clear-eyed about the harms and kind of learn the lesson from social media. I think a lot of legislators have realized we made some mistakes in how we did not more proactively take steps to ensure that that would not harm children and families. And I think we need to do the same when it comes to AI.
I guess I'm more of a tech optimist. Really, look, I mean, those are some real problems that were pointed out. Obviously, law enforcement has a lot of tools to address exploitation material online, and should continue to have those tools, and might need new tools as tech innovates. Innovation creates new problems to solve. But I guess, I do take in my book, Tech Panic, I try to take a historical frame and look back at all of the previous innovations, particularly in the communication space, and how they prompted the same level of hand-wringing that we are all so doomed by this new thing. And before social media, it was, maybe recall the panic over violent video games, how video games were creating like a new generation of serial killers. And actually now our best available social psychology research is that the extreme minority of young people, who are mostly young males, who are predisposed toward violence, actually violent video games are a healthy outlet for that violence, and actually help to deter real world violence. When I was a kid, TV was many of these same addictiveness quality problems were talked about with TV. In my book, I did a lot of research on how radio generated these exact same complaints and criticisms. And newspapers spearheaded an effort to have the radio delegitimized as a dangerous social harm for reasons that are pretty obvious, because that was competition for newspapers. And on and on and on. I found a quote from the New York Times in the 1870s, saying that Alexander Graham Bell should be hung from the neck until dead because of the negative effect his innovations were having on society. The sophists in ancient Greece said the written word was going to make it so that no one had to remember anything anymore, and that was going to ruin society. Like this goes on and on and on, and which is not to say that these new disruptions never caused any harms, but that they also create a lot of opportunities for human flourishing and enjoyment. I mean, I'm not I'm not going to lose sleep over the idea of like a particularly lonely person getting an AI girlfriend or boyfriend. Great, good for them. And that speaks to our fundamental philosophical disagreement. Whereas I don't think the government has any expertise or any moral mandate to prescribe for all people what is the healthiest social or family or religious or anything arrangement for them. I leave this choice to individuals, and I leave them to explore and experiment with the tools and innovations available. So I think AI is going to be wonderful and fascinating. I'm not afraid of it yet. I can generally like easily tell in my field of journalism, which is not known for its high standards, which products are AI so far and which are not. But maybe there'll be a day where, you know, my job no longer exists because AI can do it. That's fine. Just like my great grandparent lost his horse and buggy repairman shop to the little thing you might have heard of known as the automobile. That's just kind of how it goes. And no one right seriously thinks that the government should have acted to thwart like the development of the car or the airplane or any of those things in order to do protectionism for jobs or because, there's going to be some harms coming along. We can deal with the harms. We can give law enforcement what it needs, but we ought to be excited about what the future holds for social media and so many of these other things.
Any questions from the audience? You have one? Yeah.
Hi, I'm Elliot. I'm a senior at UNC, and I wanted to thank y'all for coming. On the topic of children, I thought that something that wasn't addressed in this debate was the issue of political participation, especially with minors. I think that in this day of age, where you have a significant amount of young people participating in social media, there is a lot of political discourse that is going on, and I think to a more significant degree than in previous generations. Do you think that this is a positive development? And if not, how should that be addressed?
Yes, I think it is a positive development. I think I was alluding to that a little bit when I said that I'm happy that a lot of young people process news and information on social media, sometimes in the forms of the reels or clips or whatever they're called on the various platforms. And young people are clearly going to be politically active. I mean, this is something Senator Rand Paul, a Republican with libertarian instincts, said when he was arguing about the Restrict Act, which was one of the federal bills that would essentially empower the federal government to ban TikTok. And he was saying, we're really going to ban like something that most young people are using a lot and really enjoying. And wouldn't that be a very far-reaching thing for the Republican Party to do that young people might remember when they turned 18? So I definitely think political participation by young people is certainly not going away and is going to increase. And social media is one way they express that positively. So, yeah.
I would just say that I think that, of course, like I want young people to be politically engaged. I guess I take a more cynical approach that I think you're referencing TikTok. Like, I'm not sure TikTok's like the best form of political engagement for young people because of all the other negative side or health effects of that platform and the real national security concerns. And so I think that there's still times where we have to recognize that something that our individual liberties have limits. And I'm not talking about, our individual liberties when it comes to necessarily political engagement, but just that there are times when our individual liberties have limits for the sake of the common good. And so in the case of TikTok, for the sake of our national security and defense, I think it's important that the government ban it. So that's something that Robby and I would disagree on. But because of the threat of a foreign adversary collecting information on all of these children and adults in the United States to be used and weaponized against us, like that's just one example where I think that there are times when the government does have a role in intervening. So I don't I don't want solutions that would diminish political participation among youth, but I think we also have to balance the realities that there are certain things that can be harmful for the sake of the common good and the kind of endurance of our self-republic, both from outside, like hostile foreign powers like China, but also, just from these social media platforms themselves and the harms that they're having on children. So I wouldn't say in my own assessment that just maybe for the one potential benefit of young children being politically engaged, does it mitigate all of the harms on them developmentally and brain wise. And again, I think there's a difference between children and adults, even in terms of those calculations related to their brain development. And I would just say, I think there are also other ways we can encourage political participation. And maybe that's just through their parents being involved in that. So again, I'm not trying to say that that's not a benefit, but I would just counter Robby's point that our individual liberties are not ultimate, that there are concerns for the flourishing and endurance of our country that need to be considered. So that's what I would just add.
So we got some questions, and maybe we have to go since we've got a lot of folks with questions, maybe do some lightning round.
Oh, okay, sure.
Okay, so my question is about it's similar to the phenomenon of AI's boyfriends and girlfriends, but it's kind of looking more here and now because I think there's like some stuff that's going on that's along those lines. We're just not quite at the point of AI boyfriends and girlfriends, but a lot of it looks at like how we are with the current trends like on OnlyFans, in which people are effectively buying love with someone who isn't an AI but is a person. It's usually men that are making up this market, but then for a lot of the women, the attention and validation they get is sort of a substitute for a relationship that may be missing in their lives. There's also, of course, the trends with dating apps today's, and effectively, dating apps, successful model is not one that helps you find your partner. It's one that helps you find dates that don't result in you finding your partner, so that you have an ongoing cash flow. Mm-hmm. And I think that's part of this discussion as well. And it's actually sort of here and now, and it's affecting people young and old today. I wanted to know both your thoughts about that.
Yes, I think those are concerns. I think that that was kind of one of my original principles, is just when technology is replacing things that we recognize as valuable. So real relationship formation and marriages and, not this kind of casual, cheap sex that's being offered by OnlyFans or even dating apps. I think that again, I'm coming from a perspective that I think we want the common good to flourish. And recognize that there are certain things that are important to human flourishing. So I do think that we have to have caution when we recognize certain technologies are actually replacing or inhibiting those goods for human flourishing and for marriage and family formation, which again, I would just go back to, like, conservatives really think the family is the foundation of government, and things that start to interfere with family and family formation are certainly dangerous. So I would agree with the assessment you had.
Not going to be surprised to hear my opinion, which is that I cannot imagine a subject that is less the domain of government policy than human dating and relationships. But I will just observe that people do meet long enduring partners and start families on dating apps. They've been very good for people to do that. You mentioned OnlyFans. Look, people, obviously, I'm probably my co-panelist here disagrees with what the legal status of prostitution and pornography should be. But even if you don't like prostitution, OnlyFans is just about is so much a better and safer way for women, anyone, to engage in sex work than relying on pimps that are abusive and having the financial aspect of it in charge of someone else. OnlyFans has made this work. In fact, now sex workers don't even have to meet or be physically present with the person paying for the service. That's how it works. So again, this will Christian conservatives will not see this as a selling point, but I think it's a positive thing that it has made the profession of prostitution, which I don't think should be illegal and has existed since the beginning of time, it's called the oldest profession for a reason, has made it much, much more safer for the people involved in it.
All right, hi, my name is Sarah. I want to say thank you to both of you. Both of you made points that I agree with and disagree with. But one thing that I'm particularly curious about is privacy. And while I want both of you to respond, this is primarily to Robby. You had mentioned, young people on social media, it can be beneficial. And maybe young people like us, like college students, maybe it could be. But some of my concern is minors and 10, 11, 12, 13-year-olds. Who is supposed to protect their privacy? So say you have a child with a social media account, how they got it, it doesn't matter, but they're posting stuff, maybe pictures or statements or something that could very well come in the next decade to be something they sincerely regret. And it's very hard to erase if it's you posted as live forever. I know as a college student, I've been to different seminars put on by the university that is like, be careful what you post. It's going to come up in an interview. It's going to come up in an internship, whatever in the future. So just be careful. And I feel like 10 to 13-year-olds maybe don't have that same guidance. So where would you think the role of privacy for minors and stuff would go into this? Like, who should protect that?
Yeah, I think privacy is very important, and you're calling to attention some kind of just social trends in life that I think are very bad and that I've spoken out against and that I write about negatively very often. I've written about a lot of canceling cases where a young person tweets or DM'd or texted something embarrassing or offensive and then gets in trouble for it later when the journalism industry does their controversial texts resurface. Did they resurface or did you surface them? I think this is bad. Frustratingly, I don't really think there's a solution other than I hope we kind of evolve a norm as a society of like not caring what dumb things people said like before they were 18 or something. I mean, that's just like an evolving social norm that I hope is taking hold. Look, I would definitely, I think it's good advice to counsel young people about their social media use. And I think it's fine for their parents to put limits on it, and including saying you shouldn't have one to a certain age. But we have to worry about like backfiring policies too. You brought up like the child exploitation stuff, which I agree is very serious. But like efforts, it's uncomfortable, but it's true. Efforts to prohibit child sexual images on the internet have like the existing state of the laws have mostly resulted in like kids themselves being charged with sex crimes because of because in fact, young people sending images of themselves to other young people constitute creation and dissemination of child pornography. Even if you're like the victim of yourself sending a photo of yourself. There have been some really insane prosecutions, again, of young people out of a very misguided effort to address online exploitation. So I think it's not saying we should not fight online exploitation, but it's like a cautionary tale. You can think well, we have a law about this now. Well, what the law technically says is if you send a nude photo of yourself and you're 15 to your 16-year-old boyfriend or girlfriend, you both could be on like the sex offender registry, and which is horrible and life ending and happens to young people all the time because of how stupid this law is written. So there's the ideal, and then there's how we actually the reality with police officers and prosecutors and legislators who have no idea what they're doing.
I'll just briefly say that I think you're highlighting a reason why I think we recognize that certain things kids are not mature enough to handle. And so I am personally an advocate for raising the age of social media to something higher, like 16 or 18, which can only be done by the federal government. And in the meantime, I'm really for these state laws because I think parents are actually the best kind of protection against those kind of dangerous types of postings that children might have. And so having laws that require parental consent and involvement in social media would really go a long way. So I would just say that those are two solutions because I do think that that's a real concern and problem.
First, thanks all three of you and to the organizations that bring you to campus. I think it's wonderful to have this kind of discourse. My question relates to censorship and government's role in censorship. And I'm thinking specifically about looking back to January 2021 when the COVID vaccines hit. And governments and schools and employers were heavily pushing the vaccines, and many on social media were challenging their safety, their effectiveness, and had their claims and their accounts suppressed because it was quote unquote misinformation. And of course, we later learned that some of these claims were actually true. Do you think there is justification for government censorship of social media platforms during a pandemic or say a war in the Middle East?
I do not. I think the federal government's behavior during COVID in terms of limiting the discourse was horrifying and has compromised the public's trust in experts and in the government in a way that probably they all deserve for doing it, but is not ideal, but it was their fault. Yes, and so much of this was in fact motivated by officials in the White House and in the CDC. President Biden got on television and said Facebook is killing people because it is not taking down more of what we, the government, have classified as misinformation. And then his one of his deputy press secretaries explicitly said, if Facebook does not do more to take down content we, the federal government, deem impermissible, we have to look at changing Section 230. Section 230 being, we've kind of alluded to it all night, this federal law that protects the platforms from some liability. Basically, I can sue if I said something libelous or defamatory. You can sue me. You can sue my employer. But if I said it on Facebook, you can't sue Facebook. You couldn't sue Twitter if I said it on Twitter. That's what Section 230 does. It protects the platform, which you can understand why that's the case, right? If Facebook could be sued for literally everything anyone writes on it, it just wouldn't work. Like, they would not allow you to post at will. They would have to approve your content ahead of time, which is not something libertarians or conservatives want to happen, which is why we're, kind of talking about how to thoughtfully, what would change about Section 230, but getting rid of it would be a total disaster for free speech. But anyway, they threatened to do that, to take that away in order to extort the companies to censor more information. I think it was very bad. As you said, the science of some of these things was very much up for debate, particularly with how effective, like requiring masks in different places or requiring different intervention strategies. There is studies pointing in multiple ways, and then how effective the cloth masks were versus the later masks. Like the guidance from the government changed on that 18 times, from don't bother to wear a mask, any mask, even if it's a cloth mask, that's great, to actually it's not doing anything unless you're wearing the really good one. So, cutting off the debate at each of those points has proven, I think, to be so futile and so counterproductive.
Yeah, I think this is the point Robby and I agree on. And just going back to the Constitution, the First Amendment, like, the government cannot decide like what speech is allowed or not. That is one of the fundamental freedoms to our, again, self-governing republic, is that the people decide, and we're able to express and exchange our ideas. So I think it's very dangerous. And then I would also just add on Section 230 that I agree with Robby. It's an important law, but it has been abused by the tech companies. They are hiding their kind of content moderation and censorship under this term, otherwise objectionable, in a portion of the law that was supposed to empower companies to take down content that's harmful to children. And so it's been really overly interpreted and expanded by the courts. And so I do think that we do need to actually restore that law to its original intent, because I don't actually think that the platforms themselves should be able to get away with censoring certain viewpoints that they don't like, whether or not they got pressure from the government to do that or not.
I'd just like to start by thanking you all for being here. My question pertains, so the internet is not used exclusively by, American nationals. Does the government have a role in suppressing propagandists? Let's say, the CCP in Russia and Iran, they have Twitter accounts, they have Instagram accounts. Does the US government have a role in suppressing foreign propagandists that pose a threat to America and the American way of living?
It's a good indirect question. I don't think the federal government should do that. I think it's better to let those accounts be out there and put out their perspective, and then be fact-checked and disagreed with by others. Also, even if the account is, I think the CCP is reprehensible. Obviously, I think Russia is reprehensible. But sometimes in some of these conflicts, you don't want to solely rely on information from one side or the other. You at least want it out there to compare what both sides have said. Sometimes even our allies in the liberal Western good democracies have put out information making themselves look better than was actually the case. And I think it would be better not to have the federal government start going, well, you can't hear from Russia today, or you can't hear from whoever, because that's propaganda. Also, can we would that definition not hold up for some U.S. Mainstream outlets that just reflexively defend whatever the government does? Are they not, propagandists by default? So I think that's a dangerous path to go down.
I would just say too, the companies already have protection for like taking down content. Like if there's ISIS, beheading videos, that would be excessively violent, which is one of the terms used in Section 230. Companies are protected for taking down that sort of content. Now they're not required to do it, but I think the law was trying to incentivize them. Again, the whole kind of original purpose of Section 230 was part of a broader law that was supposed to be helping make the internet safer for kids. So I've also written elsewhere that the kind of Good Samaritan provisions have been all carrot and no stick. And Justice Thomas has written about this, that it's been overly interpreted to give platforms liability from things that they distribute. So there's kind of publisher liability, and Section 230 was meant to give people publisher immunity because it's not their own content. But it's been overly expanded to even make platforms immune from any kind of liability for things that they knowingly distributed that were criminal content, like drug trafficking or sex trafficking. And so I actually do think that a bad Samaritan carve out to say that companies actually are required for taking down known criminal content, again, that they know about from distributing that. Again, they're not being held liable for publishing, the publisher function. But if they're knowingly facilitating sex trafficking or, drug trafficking, cartel kind of content, I think that there is a role for the government to say, this is unsafe for children and dangerous for society. And the companies should be held accountable for removing that type of harmful content instead of knowingly distributing it.
This question is specifically for Robby. I'm sure you're aware of Edward Snowden's reveal of the 2013 government mass surveillance campaign, the NSA's mass surveillance campaign. And I kind of wanted to relate that back to the Cambridge Analytica scandal, in which millions of Americans' privacy was violated in Facebook. And the Trump campaign, for example, and the Cruz campaign used this data to their advantage against the privacy of Americans. And my general question is going to be about how you stop private tyranny. I know that libertarians are focused more on stopping governmental tyranny, which I think is a noble cause. But how do you attempt to stop private tyranny, especially in the wake of privacy, for example? And a second part of my question was going to be mentioning the Arab Spring, how a lot of Middle Eastern countries use social media to kind of galvanize protests against governments and uprisings. And what if that were to happen against a corporation, in which people were to organize protests or anti-corporate sentiment? And how do you prevent in an unregulated social media system from private tyranny being imposed upon people in terms of their privacy and also the terms of freedom of expression?
Sure. I mean, the fundamental difference, obviously, which you clearly understand from bringing it up, is that when the NSA was violating our privacy, surveilling us, they were taking information that they ought not to have. They were engaging in wiretapping and those kinds of things, which they were not authorized to do. Whereas the kind of privacy being violated by the social media companies or the private companies, I mean, again, there's an argument like you gave them that information. Like, if I stand up here and shout what my birthday is, and then later I'm complaining that my privacy was violated because everybody knows my birthday. Well, I didn't. Well, I told you all my birthday. That's kind of what you're doing when you sign up for a social media account, when you start clicking around and you start giving the company information about what your preferences are, and you fill in some of that information. I mean, it starts to get kind of philosophical. In what sense do you own information about yourselves that private actors have arrived at based on your behavior, based on the things you're doing? They're learning. They're making observations about you based on behavior you're doing. And some of that, a lot of that is beneficial, frankly. A lot of that, I think it's not a bad thing that when I'm scrolling on social media, it's going to recommend me a conversation or a piece of content or a product I might want to buy based on what it knows my interest to be. This is not necessarily, this is being described as a nefarious thing, when a lot of the time it's not actually nefarious. Now, I support laws, legislation that prevent this information being shared with governments. Cambridge Analytica is actually really interesting. I probably don't have time to go into all of that right now, but I would send it to you if you Google it. It was written by my colleague at Reason, Peter Suderman, did a kind of counter programming on that whole thing. I think if you take another look, it seems to me, and my recollection from what he wrote about it, is that Cambridge Analytica massively, the firm massively overstated what they were able to do with that information, and fears that it was extremely impactful at all were basically just kind of this firm trying to talk itself up to convince investors to come on. So I would turn you to that article for actual evidence that that was the case, because overall, and this might actually probably be an area of agreement between us. I think a lot of the claims that were popular immediately after 2016 about how harmful information and bot infiltration and Russian bot infiltration on social media, like how bad it was and how impactful it was wildly and massively overstated by the mainstream media and frankly kind of sort of losers within the Democratic Party. When it was not, there's like very little evidence that, so certainly Russia did try to have an impact. I'm not denying that was the case, but it was a sliver of actual of users and content compared to like what's actually on the platform. It was massively outspent by the candidates' own efforts on social media, and there's no evidence it was tailored to actually hit like swing voters in Pennsylvania, Michigan, and Wisconsin. I don't know if you want to add.
All right, last question. This question is more targeted at Claire, but I wanted to ask, like, how do you have a law that tailors to making sure kids don't get kids don't is it you're good. I hear you. Kids don't get on social media before they're the age of 18 or 16 or 13 or whatever you want to say, because like right now they have is your birthday in, but you can just slide that back and say you're 25 or whatever and you're already on. And how do you keep that law from being used to target other like people or groups or something that someone might try to keep off social media?
If I'm understanding you correctly, we're probably asking like, how could this effectively be enforced since currently, you just type your birth date in. So I've written like a whole report on age verification. If you go to EPPC.org and you go to my scholar page, if you really like kind of getting into the weeds on the technological issues, the reason we put that out was to show that there are ways that age verification can be done that are both effective, so keeping off underage individuals, and also protective of user privacy, using something like a two-factor method. So the social media platform itself isn't conducting age verification, but a third party is, that you have to show some type of documentation or government ID to show that you're over the age threshold. And then that information is communicated to the social media platform, but you're not actually handing over any of your personal information to social media. And I think that these kind of technological solutions to age verification can make a very strong case for these laws being constitutional, that they would not violate or place undue burdens on adult speech, and they would actually effectively protect kids. And I think that's been a frustration of parents, is that so the kind of age verification has been nothing. It's been meaningless. You just kind of attest to your age and get on social media. And so we know that young kids, even younger than 13, 8 to 12-year-olds are all over these platforms. So whatever you set the age at, I completely agree with you. It actually has to be effectively enforced. And so I've written a lot on age verification methods.
Want to just wrap it up, or? Okay, well, great. Well, thank you so much, Claire and Robby, for being here tonight, and thank all of you in the audience for coming. And if we could give our speakers, panelists a hand, that'd be great.